Hello everyone, this is AnAmericanThinks, and we are back with part 3 of the grand theory of everything. So let's take a moment to recap where we are at before moving forward. In part 1, we talked about Rhaegar Targaryen facing a dwindling Targaryen bloodline and the reason for his interest in Lyanna Stark.
The booty!
No. That's not what I said. Actually, in a way, it's kind of what I said, but it's not exactly what I said. In part 2, we talked about Lyanna Stark being a high probability candidate for carrying a skin-changing gene, but most likely not knowing that she's carrying it. And for our third installment, we're looking beyond the main players in the Tower of Joy and on to the supporting cast, because there are more characters involved here than just Rhaegar and Lyanna and, spoiler alert, Jon Snow. Specifically, we are going to talk about House Hightower, House Whent, and Arthur Dayne. And now, of course, you are saying, what's the point? They're Kingsguard. They're at the tower because they're sworn to protect the royal family. Well, not so fast, because, aside from a bastard, none of the royal family is at the Tower of Joy. They were off dying in other places and not being protected by their Kingsguard. So the commander of this group was, of course, House Hightower. He is a man renowned for his fighting prowess and from a family renowned for coming down on the right side of pretty much every major war since the Dawn Age. Seriously, they're one of the oldest noble families since at least the days of the First Men. But as soon as the Andals showed up, well, turns out they liked Andals and the Faith of the Seven. And as soon as Aegon Targaryen showed up, guess what? You guessed it! Manfred Hightower opened his gates and decided he liked Targaryens. That all worked out pretty well until the Hightowers decided to support the Greens in the Dance of the Dragons, which ultimately cost Ormond and Brynden Hightower their lives, and their family sword. So, kind of a bummer there. But they seem to have learned their lesson because once the Blackfyre Rebellion rolled around, the Hightowers remained essentially neutral. We know that the Hightowers have a very long-standing history with the Citadel, claiming the title Protector of the Citadel, and even claiming a distant ancestor, Paramore the Twisted, as the founder of the Citadel. And the current Lord Leighton Hightower has been locked away in his High Tower, rumored to be studying magic, and there are implications he's even using a glass candle and all that exciting stuff. So, it might seem from what we can call an academic point of view, or a magical point of view, a Targaryen Stark child might be an interesting thing to witness, right? But ultimately, that is mostly conjecture, and it stops short of a true motivation. For House Hightower to willingly sacrifice himself, the Targaryen-Stark union must have solved a problem. So, what problems do the Hightowers have beyond the usual affairs of state that all noble families seem to have in Westeros? As it turns out, they have dragon problems. Are you ready for this? Not too long after the Targaryen conquest, Maegor Targaryen married Cerys Hightower, which was certainly an ideal marriage for the Hightowers, being able to marry into the new ruling family so quickly. Unfortunately, the marriage produced no issue, which might bring the strength of Hightower genes into question. But again, we know that the Targaryens had problems conceiving, and Maegor Targaryen in particular, so this may have been due to the Targaryen side. But the marriage indicates that Targaryens must have believed Hightowers carried a dragon gene, which certainly makes one wonder how much back and forth there was between Oldtown and Old Valyria, especially given the Blackstone Fort in Oldtown, and so on. The history of House Targaryen has always been a history of trying to perpetuate the dragon gene, and a Targaryen king who could have had his choice of any woman in his kingdom, and in fact, he ended up choosing 6 of them, must have chosen a Hightower because he suspected she might carry a dragon gene. And these suspicions were certainly proved correct because half a century later, Viserys I married Alicent Hightower and produced 4 children, all of whom were dragon riders, including 3 sons who could have only gotten the dragon gene from their mother's X chromosome. Unfortunately for the Targaryen bloodline, These successful genetics were ultimately lost during the Dance of the Dragons, but the incontrovertible proof was already in the proverbial pudding. Now, a short interjection here. We do have Rhaena Targaryen marrying Garmin Hightower and producing 6 daughters with him. However, we don't know if these daughters could have been dragon riders or dragon hatchers. It would seem that if these girls had any dragon-related abilities, more of their identity and life stories would have been passed on to history, and a Targaryen line that was left with no dragons and 5 unhatched eggs had already resorted to dragon seeds to try to find enough dragon riders. They would have probably left no stone unturned in trying to determine whether any Targaryen females could serve as dragon hatchers. So, the genetic problem of House Hightower goes something like this. We know that we've got the genes to produce dragons, but the only option we have for breeding is with Targaryens, and ever since we supported the Greens in the Dance of the Dragons, the current Targaryens don't marry us anymore, and their line is dwindling in any case. So, not only does Geralt Hightower have a sworn duty to be at the Tower of Joy, he also has massive genetic incentives to witness and verify the birth of Targaryen Stark offspring. Because if the Stark skin-changing genes can stand in for dragon genes and produce dragon riding, or better yet, dragon hatching offspring, this means that House Hightower could also get access to dragons by marrying Starks. Bachelor number 2 is House Whent, and I will tell you from the get-go, he is a much tougher nut to crack, mostly because there is so little information written about him and his house in canon sources. We know that he is one of the few remaining members of his house. His brother Walter Whent is the Lord of Harrenhal at the time of these events, and Walter's wife Sheila will outlive Walter and become the last Lady of Harrenhal by the time of the main books, cloistering herself in Harrenhal with her ghosts. Sound familiar? How about this? From what we can infer, both Sheila Whent and Walter Whent were Whents by birth. And although we cannot determine what their exact relationship was, it appears the Whent family was inbreeding. Does that sound familiar? We also know that Walter and Sheila had 4 sons and a daughter, who all died prior to the events of the main books. The daughter lived long enough to be the Queen of Love and Beauty at the start of the Tourney of Harrenhal, but we have essentially no information on the sons, implying they likely died quite young. And 2 other Whent women mentioned in the story, Arya Whent and Winifred Whent, produced no children. Does any of this sound familiar? Suffice it to say, the Whents have a problem. Although, from what we are presented with in the books, it is hard to be specific about what the problem actually is. It could have something to do with bats. This is implied by the bats on their sigil, as well as by the sigil and the legends about the Lothstons, who ruled Harrenhal prior to the Whents. We are led to believe that these sigils are a reference to the giant bats that are reputed to live in the Wailing Tower of Harrenhal, and are quite probably related to the skeletons of the giant bats seen in POV in the Cave of the Three-Eyed Crow. I'm going to include a link to one of Preston Jacobs' videos that discusses this subject in the description below. He is the first YouTuber I heard covering this theory, and, by the way, in the process of researching for this video, Preston gave me the heads up that in his next series, he will be talking about Whents and bats again. I'm definitely looking forward to hearing what he's found, and you should keep an eye open for it as well. But I also suppose that another indication for the House Whent problem can be inferred from one final member of the Whent family who we haven't mentioned yet, Minissa Whent, who just so happens to have married Hoster Tully and produced Catelyn Stark and Lysa Arryn. Now, neither Catelyn nor Lysa have displayed any manifested magical abilities by the time of the Tower of Joy. However, we readers know that Lysa would go on to produce Sweet Robin, and Catelyn would go on to produce Robb, Sansa, Bran, and Rickon. So, if House Whent were hoping to rely on Starks as potential breeding partners to save their failing line and produce superpower offspring, they were certainly barking up the right tree. They just didn't survive long enough to find out about it. And in that case, it would certainly have made sense for House Whent to stick around and witness the Targaryen Stark genetic experiment. And speaking of houses with very little information, we are now moving on to Arthur Dayne, the famous swordsman about whom so much is written, and yet about whom so little is written. Because he is only the best knight in the Seven Kingdoms, and from one of the oldest families of the First Men, so certainly we would have a lot of information on them, right? Well, no. Actually, we have even less information on House Dayne's family tree than we do House Whent's family tree. I would even go so far as to say that we intentionally have less information on House Dayne. In fact, if you peruse the Reddit forums, you can find instances of fans asking George R.R. Martin for information about the Daynes as far back as 1999. And yet to this day, despite a world encyclopedia being released and a whole dedicated history of the Targaryens, we still don't even know so much as who Arthur Dayne's father is. So, instead of focusing on what we don't know, let's start analyzing what we do. And of course, the biggest known factor defining House Dayne is their legendary house sword, Dawn. There are tons of fan theories existing about Dawn, and as always, I'll try to post links to the best videos of these in the description below, but I'd like to focus on one in particular. And by that I mean, I'd like to, but I can't. Because once upon a time in 2016, a YouTuber started developing a theory about the God's Eye and how it must have been a meteor impact crater, and how, just like meteors in our world come almost exclusively from the same source, various meteors in A Song of Ice and Fire probably also come from the same source. And then 4 months later, this YouTuber finally put out a second video talking about House Dayne and their sword Dawn, and how it probably was made out of the same stuff that crashed into the God's Eye, and how none of the observable phenomena surrounding Dawn could be explained by science. And then this YouTuber disappeared from YouTube for a year and a half and only showed up to make a brief goodbye video without ever finishing this theory. What an asshole. Oh right, that was me. And since I never really got to give you the fully developed theory, I'm going to wrap it up for you now, more than 4 years later. And as I've previously stated, since the observable phenomena cannot be explained by science, this brings us to the point in our show that I like to call, It's Magic.
It's magic, you know, never believe it's not so.
Sometime in the prehistory of the world of ice and fire, a large metallic meteorite slammed into what would become the continent of Westeros. The immediate effects of this impact would have been enormous, triggering fires, earthquakes, and tsunamis. As dust and smoke poured into the atmosphere, the weather would have changed and grown colder. The complex crater would eventually fill with water, creating a lake with a central island. But the long-term effects of this impact would quite possibly have had a greater effect for the purposes of our story. The meteorite would have been pulverized on impact at an atomic level. However, particles of the meteorite would have remained in the soil. Plant life that adapted to these soil conditions began taking on unusual characteristics, eventually becoming weirwoods. Fast forward an unknown amount of time, and a much smaller piece of this metal again falls to Westeros, this time landing in Dorne, where a tribe of wandering first men track its fall to the mouth of the Torrentine River. Their leader fashions this meteorite into a sword, and the sword has had an equally profound effect on these first men as its predecessor had on the God's Eye, so much so that it allowed their house to survive for 10,000 years, and it allows the men who wield it to be the greatest swordsmen of their time, because Dawn is more than just a good sword. It goes beyond the classical paradigm of copper being easier to shape and sharpen than stone, bronze being stronger than copper, iron being stronger than bronze, steel being less brittle than iron, and finally, Valyrian steel being lighter, stronger, and sharper than any castle-forged steel. Dawn competes with other blades at a different level, and we know this because Arthur Dayne, as well as other Swords of the Morning before him, are known for being good swordsmen, not for being normal swordsmen who happen to carry a really good sword. So if Dawn is special, it is because Dawn gives the men who can wield it a power that other swordsmen don't possess. It is the reason why George R.R. Martin stated that if he had to ride a dragon, he would ride the most powerful dragon of all, Balerion. But if he had to wield a sword, he would not want to wield a Targaryen sword, but rather to brandish Dawn. And what great power does Dawn have, you might ask? Telepathy. Dawn allows the Sword of the Morning to understand his opponent's thoughts and moves before he actually makes them, and thereby leaves witnesses to conclude that the Sword of the Morning is a fantastically good swordsman. And while these men would certainly be accomplished swordsmen in their own right, when wielding Dawn, they would become almost unbeatable. This is why Arthur Dayne loses tourneys jousting with Prince Rhaegar, because he is fighting with lances instead of with Dawn. This is why George R. R. Martin states that Barristan Selmy and Arthur Dayne were an even match, but if Arthur Dayne were armed with Dawn, he would win. And if at this point you are still not convinced, let me give you one more piece of evidence that Dawn grants telepathic abilities. Because not everyone can use it. Of course, the Danes maintain the facade that not any old Dane can be Sword of the Morning because they are not worthy, which makes for a nice bit of plausible deniability if you want to downplay your house's asymmetrical advantage. But as we have seen played out over and over in these books, in the cutthroat world of the Game of Thrones, every house invariably tries to make use of every advantage it can muster. So if any Dane could wield Dawn, then every Dane would wield Dawn. But just like every Stark isn't a warg, and every Targaryen isn't a dragon rider, so too every Dane can't be a Sword of the Morning. As it turns out, House Dayne has a problem. And if Winds of Winter ever gets released, and we find out that House Dayne has been inbreeding, you can say you heard it here first, because they do have some of the telltale signs of inbreeding that we've previously discussed. One being a cadet house of high hermitage that ostensibly shares a similar gene pool that they could use for line breeding, similar to how the Starks often breed with Karstarks. And the second being an apparent dwindling line of Danes, seemingly reduced now to the young Edric Dayne and possibly his aunt Arya Dayne, who has barely even been given mention in the books. So, do I think the Danes have a problem? Yeah, I do. And do I think that problem could be solved by intermarrying with Starks? Yeah, I do. And as it turns out, I'm not the only one, because the Danes already tried it. You remember that same tourney where Rhaegar defeated Arthur Dayne? That's supposedly the same tourney where Arthur's sister Ashara Dayne fell in love with a Stark. And while there's some debate over whether it was Brandon Stark or Ned Stark, Ashara appears to have gotten pregnant, and goes on to commit suicide after her child is stillborn. And wait, isn't infertility another one of the signs of inbreeding? Do I think the Danes have a problem? Do I think Arthur Dayne has a reason to stick around and witness the great Targaryen Stark genetic experiment? Yeah, I do. And you might have guessed it by now, the Kingsguard aren't the only ones with a problem, because we're only halfway through the belligerents present for the climactic battle at the Tower of Joy, and we're going to talk about the other side in Part 4. Okay, for those of you who stuck it out this far, here's a little Easter egg. I had a few viewers 4 years ago who asked me on my original God's Eye Theory videos if I believed the black stone worshipped by the Bloodstone Emperor was related to the God's Eye and to Dawn. And since I'm not developing any more videos in that series of videos, I'm going to give you that answer here. In short, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that I think similar pieces fell on other parts of the world of Ice and Fire and influenced the people who found them. No, in the sense that the legends connected to the Bloodstone Emperor come from a very long time ago and can't be witnessed by modern POV characters like Dawn or like Weirwoods. But is it a related legend? Yes, it's definitely a related legend. And I'm sure you can draw your own conclusions from here quite easily.